gavel fell with a sound that echoed through the crowded auction house like thunder across the mountains. Lauren Powell stood frozen as the auctioneer's voice boomed over the murmurs of the gathering crowd. Sold to the lady in blue for $50. Her trembling hands clutched the worn leather purse that now held $50 less, money she could barely afford to spend. But as she looked across the room at the small boy who had just become her responsibility, she knew she had made the only choice her heart would allow. The child, no more than 8 years old, sat hunched on a wooden crate near the auction block, his clothes torn and dirty, his eyes holding a hollow emptiness that no child should ever possess. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows cast by the afternoon sun streaming through the dusty windows, stood a man whose presence seemed to fill the room despite his attempts to remain hidden. Daniel Allen's face bore the marks of recent violence, his left eye swollen shut, his lip split and crusted with dried blood. His massive frame was bent with exhaustion, but his good eye never left the boy who had just been sold like livestock. Lauren had arrived at the auction that morning with no intention of changing anyone's life, least of all her own. 7 months pregnant and struggling to make ends meet in the harsh mountain town of Cedar Ridge, she had come only to sell her late husband's tools, hoping to raise enough money to see her through the winter months ahead. The baby growing inside her seemed to sense the tension in the room, shifting restlessly as she made her way through the crowd of bidders and onlookers. The story of how they had all arrived at this moment began 3 days earlier, when the worst storm in decades had swept through the mountain passes, bringing with it a series of events that would test the very soul of their small community. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and where judgment came as easily as breathing. It was also a place where the harsh realities of frontier life could strip away a person's humanity as surely as the bitter mountain winds could strip the leaves from the trees. Daniel Allen had never been welcomed in Cedar Ridge, despite having lived in a crude cabin high in the mountains above the town for nearly 3 years. The townspeople whispered about the giant of a man who rarely came down from his isolated home, who traded furs and game for supplies, but spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. They called him dangerous, unstable, a threat to their peaceful community. They invented stories about his past, each tale more lurid than the last, until the truth of who he was became lost beneath layers of fear and prejudice. The truth was far simpler and infinitely more tragic than any of their whispered rumors. Daniel Allen was a man destroyed by loss, a former soldier who had returned from the war to find his wife and infant daughter dead from fever, his farm sold for taxes, his entire world reduced to ashes and memories. He had fled to the mountains, not out of madness, but out of a grief so profound that solitude seemed the only mercy he could offer himself. The boy, Justin Brooks, was not his son by blood, but by choice, a choice that had cost them both more than either could have imagined. Justin had appeared at Daniel's cabin door 6 months earlier, half-starved and running from a life that had shown him nothing but cruelty. His real parents had died in a mining accident, leaving him to the tender mercies of an uncle who saw him as nothing more than free labor and a convenient target for his drunken rages. When the boy finally found the courage to run, the mountains had seemed like salvation, and Daniel's isolated cabin like a sanctuary. For the first time in years, Daniel had found a reason to care whether he lived or died, and Justin had found the closest thing to a father he had ever known. Their peaceful existence had lasted until 3 days ago, when a group of men from town had made the treacherous climb to Daniel's cabin. Led by Richard Kim, the town's self-appointed moral authority and owner of the largest general store, they had come with accusations and demands. Someone had been stealing livestock, they claimed, and all evidence pointed to the mountain man and his boy. The fact that they had no actual evidence seemed irrelevant to their sense of righteous indignation. Daniel had tried to reason with them, to explain that he and Justin lived off the land and had no need to steal anyone's cattle. But reason had no place in the minds of men who had already decided on guilt and were looking only for an excuse to act on their long-held prejudices. The confrontation had turned violent quickly, with Daniel fighting desperately to protect Justin from men who seemed determined to drag them both back to town for what they called justice, but what looked suspiciously like revenge. The beating had been savage and one-sided. Daniel was a large man and strong from his years of mountain living, but he was outnumbered 5-1, and his primary concern had been shielding Justin from harm rather than defending himself. They had left him bloodied and barely conscious in the dirt outside his cabin, taking Justin with them as evidence of their success. The boys' terrified cries as they dragged him away had echoed through the mountain valleys long after the men had disappeared down the trail. Lauren Powell had heard about the capture secondhand as gossip filtered through the small community like water through a sieve. She had been in the general store, trading eggs from her few chickens for flour and sugar, when the talk turned to the mountain man and his boy. The women gathered around the counter spoke of the incident with a mixture of satisfaction and excitement, as if they had witnessed the capture of some dangerous wild animal rather than the brutalization of a human being. "They got that mountain devil and his brat," announced Helen Murphy, the banker's wife, her voice filled with vindictive pleasure. "Richard Kim and his boys went up there and brought them both down. The man's locked up in the jail, and the boy's going to be sold at auction to pay for the damages he's caused." Lauren had listened to the conversation with growing horror, her hand instinctively moving to protect the child growing within her. The casual cruelty of their words, the satisfaction they took in the suffering of others, struck her like a physical blow. She had known these people all her life, had considered many of them friends, but in that moment they seemed like strangers wearing familiar faces. "What damages?" she had asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the chatter of the other women. Helen Murphy had turned to her with the expression of someone eager to share particularly juicy gossip. "Why, all the cattle that's been going missing. Of course. Everyone knows it was them doing the stealing. Now they'll pay for it, one way or another." But Lauren had pressed for details, and the more questions she asked, the more it became clear that no one actually knew anything concrete about the supposed thefts. The evidence was purely circumstantial, based on nothing more than suspicion and the town's collective desire to blame their problems on the convenient outsider. When she asked to see proof of the stolen cattle or witnesses to the thefts, the women had grown defensive and changed the subject. That night, Lauren had lain awake in her small cabin, her hands resting on her swollen belly as she thought about the boy who was to be sold like property to pay for crimes that might exist only in the imagination of frightened townspeople. She thought about her own child, still months from being born, and wondered what kind of world she was bringing him or her into. The baby kicked restlessly inside her, as if sensing her distress, and she whispered promises into the darkness that she wasn't sure she could keep. The next morning had brought news that made her heart sink even further. Daniel Allen had died during the night in his jail cell, his injuries from the beating proving more severe than anyone had realized. Or perhaps, as some whispered, he had simply given up the will to live, knowing that he could not protect the boy who had become his whole world. Either way, Justin was now completely alone, an orphan twice over, with no one to speak for him or defend him against the town's desire for vengeance. Lauren had made her decision in that moment, though she could not have explained the reasoning behind it to anyone, least of all herself. She was a widow, 7 months pregnant, with barely enough money to support herself through the coming winter. The last thing she needed was to take on the responsibility of caring for another mouth to feed, especially a boy who came with the stigma of association with the town's designated villain. But something deep inside her, some fundamental sense of right and wrong that had survived her own losses and hardships, would not let her stand by and watch a child be sacrificed to satisfy the community's need for a scapegoat. The auction was held 2 days later in the town's largest building, a combination meeting hall and warehouse that served as the center of Cedar Ridge's commercial life. Lauren had arrived early, her precious $50 hidden in the bottom of her worn purse, praying that it would be enough to outbid anyone else who might want to claim the boy. She had told herself that she was being practical, that an 8-year-old boy could help with chores and provide some measure of security for a woman living alone. But as she watched Justin being led to the auction block like livestock, she knew that practicality had nothing to do with her decision. The boy looked smaller than she remembered, dwarfed by the adult men who surrounded him and handled him with casual indifference. His clothes were the same torn and dirty garments he had worn when they brought him down from the mountain, and his face held an expression of such resigned despair that it broke her heart to see it. He did not look at the crowd gathered to bid on his future, did not seem to register the voices discussing his potential value as cheap labor. He simply stood where they placed him and waited for his fate to be decided by strangers. The bidding had been desultory at first, with only a few half-hearted offers from men looking for farm hands or household help. $50 was more than most were willing to pay for a boy with such a questionable background, especially one who looked as broken and spiritless as Justin appeared. Lauren had begun to hope that her modest bid would be sufficient when Richard Kim stepped forward with a counteroffer that made her blood run cold. $60, he announced in a voice that carried clearly through the crowded room. I'll take the boy and put him to work in my store. Teach him the value of honest labor and proper respect for authority. The satisfaction in Kim's voice made it clear that his interest in Justin had nothing to do with needing help in his store, and everything to do with continuing the punishment that had begun with Daniel's death. Lauren had seen the way Kim looked at the boy, had heard the undertone of cruelty in his words, and she knew that placing Justin in that man's care would be tantamount to condemning him to a life of systematic abuse and degradation. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Lauren had stood up from her seat in the back of the room and called out her counterbid, $75. The words had seemed to come from someone else, someone braver and more reckless than she had ever imagined herself to be. Every eye in the room had turned to stare at the pregnant woman who had dared to challenge Richard Kim's bid, and she had felt her face burn with embarrassment and fear. Kim had turned to look at her with an expression of surprise and growing anger. "Mrs. Powell," he had said in a voice that dripped with condescension, "surely you're not serious about taking on such a burden in your condition. This boy has been raised by a criminal and a thief. He'll be nothing but trouble for a woman in your situation." Lauren had felt the weight of every stare in the room, had heard the whispered comments and speculation about her sanity and her motives. Part of her had wanted to sit back down, to let Kim have his way and avoid the confrontation that was clearly building. But then she had looked at Justin, had seen the flicker of hope that had appeared in his eyes for the first time since she had entered the building, and she had found the courage to stand her ground. $80, she had said, her voice stronger now despite the trembling in her hands. "And I'll thank you to keep your opinions about my situation to yourself, Mr. Kim." The room had erupted in murmurs and gasps at her boldness, but Lauren had kept her eyes fixed on Justin, drawing strength from the desperate hope she saw reflected in his young face. Kim had bid again, raising the stakes to $85, but Lauren could see that he was growing frustrated with her unexpected resistance. He had expected to claim the boy easily, to add this final humiliation to the mountain man's legacy, and her interference was spoiling his moment of triumph. $90, Lauren had called out, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. It was more money than she had, more than she could afford to spend even if she had possessed it. But she had made her choice and would see it through to whatever end awaited them all. Kim's face had darkened with rage at her continued defiance, and for a moment Lauren had thought he might abandon the pretense of civilized bidding and simply take the boy by force. But even Richard Kim was not quite prepared to reveal the full extent of his cruelty in front of the entire town. And after a long moment of tense silence, he had shaken his head and stepped back from the auction block. "Let her have him," he had said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "When that boy brings nothing but trouble to her door, don't come crying to the rest of us for help. Some people have to learn their lessons the hard way." The auctioneer had called for any final bids, but the room had remained silent. Lauren's $90 offer stood alone, and with the fall of the gavel, Justin Brooks had become her responsibility. She had walked to the front of the room on unsteady legs, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, and had counted out the money she didn't have into the auctioneer's waiting hand. The transaction had been completed with businesslike efficiency, as if they were dealing with the sale of livestock rather than the transfer of a human being's future. Lauren had been handed a piece of paper that officially made her Justin's guardian, and the boy had been released from the men who had been holding him in place. He had approached her slowly, uncertainly, as if he couldn't quite believe that his ordeal was over. "Ma'am," he had whispered, his voice hoarse from crying and fear, "are you really going to take care of me?" Lauren had knelt down despite her pregnancy, bringing herself to his eye level, and had looked into the face of the child who had just become her son in every way that mattered. "Yes," she had said simply, her voice thick with emotion she was struggling to control. "You're safe now. You're going to come home with me, and no one is ever going to hurt you again." The walk from the auction house to Lauren's cabin had been the longest journey of her life, though it covered less than half a mile through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge. Every step had been taken under the watchful eyes of townspeople who gathered in doorways and windows to stare at the pregnant woman and the boy she had just purchased. Some faces showed curiosity, others disapproval, and more than a few displayed the kind of malicious satisfaction that comes from watching someone make what appears to be a catastrophic mistake. Justin had walked beside her in silence, his small hand clutched tightly in hers, his eyes darting nervously at every sound and movement around them. Lauren could feel the tension in his thin frame, could sense that he was prepared to run at the first sign of danger or betrayal. The trust between them was fragile and new, built on nothing more than her impulsive act of kindness and his desperate need for someone, anyone, to care about his fate. Lauren's cabin sat at the edge of town, a modest structure that her late husband had built with his own hands before consumption had claimed his life 2 years earlier. It was small but well constructed, with a stone fireplace that provided warmth during the harsh mountain winters and a garden plot that supplied vegetables through the growing season. It was not much, but it was home, and as they approached the front door, Lauren felt a mixture of pride and anxiety about bringing Justin into her simple world. "This is where we live," she said, as she pushed open the wooden door and gestured for Justin to enter ahead of her. "It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry, and there's always food on the table." Justin stepped cautiously across the threshold, his eyes taking in every detail of the single room that served as kitchen, living area, and Lauren's bedroom. A ladder led to a small loft space under the eaves where her husband had once stored tools and supplies. The furnishings were simple but clean, handmade pieces that showed the care and skill of their creator. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace, its smooth wood worn to a soft patina by years of use. "Are you hungry?" Lauren asked, moving toward the small stove that dominated one corner of the room. "I've got some stew left from yesterday and fresh bread from this morning." Justin nodded wordlessly, still overwhelmed by the sudden change in his circumstances. Just hours ago, he had been facing the prospect of being sold to Richard Kim, a fate that had filled him with terror, based on the stories Daniel had told him about the man's cruelty. Now he was standing in a warm, comfortable home with a woman who had risked everything to save him from that fate. As Lauren busied herself preparing a meal, Justin climbed the ladder to explore the loft space that would become his bedroom. The area was small but private, with a single window that looked out over the mountains where he had spent the happiest months of his young life. The sight of those familiar peaks brought tears to his eyes as he remembered Daniel, the man who had been more of a father to him than his own blood relatives had ever been. "He was a good man," Lauren said softly from the bottom of the ladder, having noticed the direction of Justin's gaze. "Whatever they said about him in town, I could see it in his eyes when they brought you both down from the mountain. He loved you like his own son." Justin climbed down from the loft and sat at the small table where Lauren had placed a bowl of steaming stew and a thick slice of bread. The food was simple but delicious, the first real meal he had eaten since his capture 3 days earlier. As he ate, Lauren settled into her rocking chair and watched him with a mixture of maternal concern and quiet satisfaction. "What's going to happen to me?" Justin asked between bites, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, after your baby comes and you don't need me anymore." Lauren felt her heart break at the question. At the assumption that his place in her home was temporary and conditional, it spoke to a lifetime of abandonment and disappointment, of being treated as a burden rather than a blessing. She rose from her chair and moved to sit across from him at the table, her hands folded over her swollen belly. "Justin," she said firmly, waiting until he looked up from his bowl to meet her eyes, "you're not going anywhere. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. When the baby comes, he or she will be lucky to have a big brother like you to help take care of them." The boy's spoon clattered against his bowl as his hands began to shake with emotion. "You really mean that? You're not just saying it because you feel sorry for me?" I'm saying it because it's true, Lauren replied, reaching across the table to cover his small hands with her own. I don't know what the future holds for any of us, but I know that we're family now. You and me and the baby that's coming. We'll face whatever comes together. Justin had begun to cry then, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. All the fear and grief and loneliness of the past few days, all the pain of losing Daniel and facing an uncertain future, poured out of him in a flood of tears that seemed like it might never end. Lauren had risen from her chair and gathered him into her arms, holding him against her shoulder, while he wept for everything he had lost and everything he had found. They had stayed that way for a long time, the pregnant woman and the orphan boy, finding comfort in each other's presence as the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows and painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Outside, the town of Cedar Ridge went about its business, but inside the small cabin at the edge of the settlement, a new family was being born from the ashes of tragedy and loss. As the days passed, Lauren and Justin began to establish the routines that would define their life together. Justin proved to be a capable and willing helper, taking on chores around the cabin and garden with an eagerness that spoke to his desperate desire to prove his worth. He chopped wood for the fireplace, tended the chickens that provided their eggs, and helped Lauren with the endless tasks of maintaining their small homestead. More importantly, he began to talk about his life with Daniel, sharing memories of the man who had saved him from his abusive uncle and given him the first taste of genuine love and security he had ever known. Lauren listened to these stories with growing understanding of the bond that had existed between the mountain man and the boy, and of the magnitude of the loss that Justin was struggling to process. He taught me to read, Justin said one evening as they sat by the fireplace, Lauren working on knitting clothes for the coming baby while Justin practiced his letters on a slate board. Said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you, no matter how poor you were or where you came from. Lauren smiled at this evidence of Daniel's wisdom and care. He was right about that, and we'll make sure you keep learning. I've got some books that belong to my husband, and when the baby comes and things settle down, maybe we can arrange for you to attend school with the other children in town. Justin's face had darkened at the mention of school and the other children. They won't want me there. Their parents all think I'm bad because of what they said about Daniel. They'll say I don't belong. Then we'll prove them wrong, Lauren had replied with quiet determination. We'll show them that you're a good boy from a good family. It may take time, but people can change their minds when they see the truth. The truth of Lauren's optimism was tested sooner than either of them expected. 3 weeks after the auction, as Lauren was hanging laundry on the line behind their cabin, she was approached by a delegation of women from town led by Helen Murphy, the banker's wife who had taken such pleasure in gossiping about Daniel's capture. The women's faces wore expressions of barely concealed disapproval, mixed with what appeared to be genuine concern. Lauren, dear, Helen began in the tone of voice reserved for speaking to children and the mentally impaired. We've come to talk to you about your situation. We're worried about you, trying to manage on your own with that boy and a baby on the way. Lauren continued hanging clothes on the line, not trusting herself to speak immediately. She could sense Justin watching from the cabin window, could feel his anxiety even at this distance. The boy had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect potential threats, a survival skill learned through years of living with uncertainty and danger. I appreciate your concern, Lauren said finally, her voice carefully neutral. But Justin and I are managing just fine. He's been a tremendous help, actually. But that's just it, dear, interjected Karen Myers, the preacher's wife. You shouldn't have to manage at all. A woman in your condition needs to be thinking about her own child, not taking on the burden of caring for someone else's problem. The casual cruelty of referring to Justin as someone else's problem hit Lauren like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain calm. These women saw themselves as pillars of the community, as moral authorities whose opinions carried weight and influence. Alienating them completely would only make life more difficult for Justin in the long run. Justin isn't a problem, Lauren said firmly, turning to face the group of women with her chin raised in defiance. He's a good boy who's been through more tragedy than any child should have to endure. He deserves compassion, not judgment. Helen Murphy's expression hardened at Lauren's refusal to accept their guidance. Lauren, we all know you mean well, but you're being naive. That boy was raised by a criminal and a thief. Bad blood will tell, mark my words. When he starts causing trouble, and he will, don't expect the rest of us to clean up the mess. What trouble has he caused so far? Lauren challenged, her patience finally beginning to fray. He helps with chores. He's learning to read and write. He's polite and respectful. What exactly are you so afraid of? The women exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with being asked to provide specific examples of Justin's supposed dangerous nature. Their fears were based on prejudice and assumption rather than any actual evidence. And Lauren's direct questioning forced them to confront the weakness of their position. It's not about what he's done, Evelyn Sanchez said finally, her voice defensive. It's about what he might do. Children learn from the adults who raise them, and that mountain man was no kind of role model for a growing boy. Lauren felt her temper flare at this attack on Daniel's memory. That mountain man died protecting Justin from a mob that beat him half to death based on nothing more than suspicion and gossip. If you want to talk about role models, maybe you should look at your own behavior before judging his. The confrontation had escalated beyond polite disagreement into something approaching open hostility, and Lauren could see that the women were preparing to leave with their mission unaccomplished. But Helen Murphy had one final shot to fire, one last attempt to force Lauren to see reason as they defined it. Fine, she said, her voice cold with disapproval. Keep the boy if you're so determined to ruin your life. But don't expect any help from the decent people in this town when everything falls apart. You've made your choice, and you'll have to live with the consequences. The women had departed in a rustle of skirts and self-righteous indignation, leaving Lauren standing alone by her clothesline with her heart pounding and her hands shaking with anger. Justin had emerged from the cabin as soon as they were out of sight, his face pale with worry and something that looked dangerously like guilt. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ground at his feet. I'm causing you trouble with your friends. Maybe I should go somewhere else. Find another place to live. Lauren had knelt down in front of him, ignoring the awkwardness of her pregnant belly, and had taken his face gently in her hands. Justin Brooks, she said firmly, you look at me when I'm talking to you. Those women are not my friends, and they never were if they can't see what a good person you are. You're not going anywhere, do you understand me? This is your home, and I'm your family, and that's not going to change no matter what anyone else thinks or says. The boy had searched her face for any sign of doubt or reservation, any hint that her words were motivated by pity rather than genuine love. But Lauren's expression was steady and sure, her voice filled with a conviction that admitted no possibility of wavering. Slowly, tentatively, Justin had nodded his acceptance of her promise. The incident with the delegation of concerned women had marked a turning point in Lauren and Justin's relationship with the town of Cedar Ridge. Where before there had been curiosity and disapproval, now there was active hostility from some quarters and careful avoidance from others. Lauren found that certain shops were suddenly out of the items she needed, that conversations stopped when she entered a room, that invitations to social gatherings that had once been routine were no longer extended, but for every door that closed, another seemed to open. There were people in Cedar Ridge who had been quietly horrified by the treatment of Daniel Allen and the auction of his boy, people who lacked the courage to speak out publicly, but who found ways to show their support privately. Fresh vegetables appeared on Lauren's doorstep with no accompanying note. Justin would find small gifts waiting for him in the garden, books and carved toys left by anonymous benefactors who wanted to help but feared the social consequences of being identified. Most surprising of all was the support that came from Cynthia Cooper, the town's school teacher and one of the few unmarried professional women in Cedar Ridge. Cynthia had appeared at Lauren's door one evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, carrying a leather satchel filled with books and educational materials. I heard that Justin is learning to read, she had said without preamble, her manner brisk and businesslike. I thought he might benefit from some additional instruction. I have time in the evenings, and it would be my pleasure to help. Lauren had invited her in, grateful for both the offer of educational support and the implicit acceptance that it represented. Cynthia was a respected member of the community, someone whose opinion carried weight with the more reasonable citizens of Cedar Ridge. Her willingness to associate with Lauren and Justin sent a clear message that not everyone in town had succumbed to prejudice and fear. Over the following weeks, Cynthia's evening visits became a regular occurrence. She worked with Justin on reading and arithmetic, helped him practice his handwriting, and introduced him to subjects like history and geography that expanded his understanding of the world beyond the mountains. More importantly, she treated him with the same respect and attention she would give to any of her regular students, refusing to see him as damaged goods or a charity case. Under Cynthia's patient instruction, Justin's natural intelligence began to flourish. He had an eager mind that had been starved for intellectual stimulation during his years with his abusive uncle, and Daniel's brief but loving tutelage had only whetted his appetite for learning. He devoured books with the same intensity he had once applied to survival, staying up late by lamplight to finish stories and struggling through difficult passages with determination that impressed both women. "He's remarkably bright," Cynthia told Lauren one evening after Justin had gone to bed in his loft. "With proper schooling, he could go far in life, perhaps even to college someday, if circumstances permit." Lauren had felt a surge of pride at this assessment, mixed with a growing determination to ensure that Justin would have every opportunity to fulfill his potential. The baby growing inside her kicked restlessly, as if responding to her emotional state, and she found herself making silent promises to both of her children about the future she would build for them. As Lauren's pregnancy progressed into its final month, the physical demands of maintaining their homestead became increasingly challenging. Justin had taken on more and more of the heavy work, chopping wood, carrying water, and tending the garden with a maturity that seemed far beyond his years. He watched Lauren with the protective concern of someone who had already lost too many people he cared about, hovering nearby whenever she seemed tired or uncomfortable. "You don't have to take care of me," Lauren told him one afternoon as he insisted on carrying a basket of eggs that she was perfectly capable of managing herself. "I'm pregnant, not helpless." "I know," Justin replied seriously, his young face wearing an expression of adult responsibility. "But Daniel always said that family takes care of family, and you're the only family I've got now." The simple honesty of his words brought tears to Lauren's eyes, as did the casual way he had included her in his definition of family. It was a gift beyond price, this trust and love from a child who had every reason to guard his heart against further loss. She resolved once again to prove herself worthy of the faith he had placed in her. The baby chose to make his appearance on a cold November night when the first serious snow of the season was beginning to fall across the mountain valleys. Lauren had been experiencing mild contractions throughout the day, but had dismissed them as the false labor that often preceded actual birth. It wasn't until the pains became regular and intense that she realized her time had come. "Justin," she called from her bed, her voice tight with pain and effort, "I need you to go get Mrs. Henderson. Tell her the baby is coming now." Mrs. Henderson was the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to a midwife, an older woman who had assisted at dozens of births over the years. She lived only a few streets away, but in the growing darkness and swirling snow, the distance seemed much greater. Justin had bundled himself into his warmest clothes and set out into the storm without hesitation, driven by the same fierce protectiveness that had motivated his every action since joining Lauren's household. The next few hours had passed in a blur of pain and effort and overwhelming emotion. Mrs. Henderson had arrived just in time to assist with the delivery, her experienced hands and calm demeanor providing the guidance that Lauren desperately needed. Justin had waited in the main room of the cabin, pacing nervously and jumping at every sound from the bedroom area. When the baby's first cry finally echoed through the small cabin, Justin had felt a rush of relief so intense it left him dizzy. A few minutes later, Mrs. Henderson had emerged from behind the curtain that divided the sleeping area from the rest of the room, her face beaming with satisfaction. "You have a healthy baby brother," she announced to Justin, whose face had lit up with joy at the news. "Your mother is tired but doing well, and she's asking for you." Justin had approached the bed where Lauren lay, holding her newborn son, with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. The baby was tiny and red and wrinkled, But to Justin, he was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. This was his brother, his family, proof that he truly belonged somewhere in the world. "What are you going to name him?" Justin asked softly, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. Lauren looked up at the boy who had become her son in every way that mattered, then down at the infant who would grow up knowing Justin as his big brother from the very beginning. "I was thinking we might call him Daniel," she said quietly. After someone who understood what it meant to love a child enough to die protecting him. Justin's eyes had filled with tears at the honor being paid to the man who had saved his life and given him hope for the future. It was a fitting tribute, a way of ensuring that Daniel Allen's memory would live on in the next generation of their small, unconventional family. The birth of baby Daniel marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with the ordinary challenges and extraordinary joys of raising children in a harsh but beautiful land. Justin threw himself into his role as big brother with the same intensity he brought to everything else, helping with feedings and diaper changes, entertaining the baby with songs and stories, and standing guard over his sleep with protective vigilance. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge gradually began to soften their attitudes toward Lauren's unusual household, won over by time and proximity to the reality of their situation. It was hard to maintain prejudice against a family that was clearly thriving. Hard to see threat in a boy who spent his days helping his pregnant mother and his evenings studying with the school teacher. The dire predictions of trouble and corruption failed to materialize, replaced instead by evidence of love, stability, and mutual support. Richard Kim remained a holdout, nursing his resentment over being outbid at the auction and waiting for vindication of his warnings about Justin's dangerous nature. But even his influence was waning as more and more people began to see the Brooks family, as they had come to be known, as valuable members of their community rather than dangerous outsiders. Spring brought new challenges and new opportunities. Lauren's recovery from childbirth had been swift and complete, allowing her to resume her full participation in the life of their homestead. Justin had grown several inches over the winter months, his frame filling out with good food and security, his face losing the haunted look that had marked him during his early days with Lauren. Cynthia Cooper had approached Lauren with a proposal that would change Justin's life in ways none of them could have imagined. The territorial government was offering scholarships to promising students from frontier communities, providing opportunities for advanced education that would otherwise be impossible for families of modest means. Justin's academic progress had been so remarkable that Cynthia believed he would be a strong candidate for such assistance. "He has the ability to go as far as his ambition will take him," Cynthia explained as they watched Justin playing with baby Daniel in the garden. "With proper education, he could become a teacher himself, or a lawyer, or even a doctor. The frontier needs educated men who understand the struggles of ordinary people." Lauren had felt a mixture of pride and trepidation at this prospect. The idea of Justin achieving great things in life filled her with joy, but the thought of him leaving their small family to pursue his education was almost too painful to contemplate. He had become so central to her existence, so integral to her sense of identity as a mother and protector, that imagining life without him seemed impossible. But when she discussed the opportunity with Justin himself, his response had surprised her with its maturity and thoughtfulness. "I want to learn everything I can," he said seriously, "but I don't want to leave you and Daniel. You're my family, and families stick together." "Sometimes," Lauren had replied gently, "families have to be apart for a while so that everyone can become the best person they can be. If you have a chance to get an education that will help you build a good life, then that's what you should do. Daniel and I will be here waiting for you when you're ready to come home." The conversation had continued over several days, with all three adults working to help Justin understand the magnitude of the opportunity being offered and the importance of making the right decision for his future. In the end, it was Justin himself who made the choice, demonstrating the wisdom and strength of character that Daniel Allen had seen in him from the very beginning. "I'll go," he said finally, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "But only if you promise that this will always be my home and that you'll always be my family, no matter how far away I go or how long I'm gone." Lauren had gathered him into her arms then. This boy who had grown so much in the months since she had impulsively bid on his future at a frontier auction. "I promise," she whispered into his hair, "you'll always have a place here with us. You're my son, Justin Brooks, and nothing will ever change that." As they stood together in the doorway of their small cabin, Lauren holding baby Daniel while Justin prepared for the journey that would take him toward his destiny, the setting sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. The town of Cedar Ridge spread out below them, its people going about their evening routines in the peaceful certainty that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for growth. Lauren thought about the chain of events that had brought them all to this moment, the tragedy and loss that had preceded the love and hope that now defined their lives. Daniel Allen's sacrifice had not been in vain, she realized. His love for Justin had created ripples that would extend far into the future, touching lives and changing destinies in ways that the mountain man could never have imagined. The pregnant woman who had once stood in an auction house and risked everything to save a frightened boy had become the mother of two sons, each of whom would carry forward the lessons of courage and compassion that their unique family had taught them. And in the years to come, as Justin's education opened doors to opportunities that would benefit not just himself, but the entire frontier community, people would remember the day when love triumphed over prejudice, when one woman's act of defiant kindness changed the course of multiple lives forever.